Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Today we will be studying the chapter of inflation, and this is basically our third lecture in the series. So, the previous two that we studied were on the government's macroeconomic objective, and we also studied about taxation. So, we know the first macroeconomic objective that most central governments have is inflation. And what inflation is? It is a general and sustained rise in the level of prices of goods and services. That is, prices of the vast majority of goods and services, they keep on rising. Now, if inflation is generalized, that means the increase should be in a wide variety of items. The increase in prices should be measured in a wide variety of items, not just one. And sustained is actually the continuous rise in prices. Now, as you can see over here, that a 13% rise in house prices, the price of petrol source. Now, petrol is actually one commodity that if you increase the price of petrol, that will bring about a knock-on impact as an increase in prices of the vast majority of items in the economy. So remember, we have the first part in every question in section B, that's a definition. So the examiner can ask you, define inflation. So you have to answer it that inflation is a generalized and sustained rise in the level of prices of goods and services in an economy. Now, there are certain degrees of inflation. Now, inflation in an economy can occur in a variety of degrees that range from the mild to the severe. Also, inflation can be distinguished into stable versus accelerating inflation, as well as anticipated versus unanticipated inflation. Accelerating inflation is likely to have a much more serious consequence to the economy than a stable rate. Accelerating inflation creates instability and uncertainty. Firms can be discouraged from undertaking investment. Consumers may react by bringing forward their consumption so that aggregate demand continues to rise and prices continue to rise. A stable rate of inflation allows the economy to plan and protect itself from the effects of such price increases. In some cases, such a stable rate may well indicate a healthy growth in aggregate demand. Anticipated inflation is one in which the general price level is close to the economy's expectation, so that interest rates, wages, social security benefits, etc., have been adjusted to accommodate the expected change in the general price level. Unanticipated inflation, that is either unexpected or higher than expected, causes instability and uncertainty, resulting in an arbitrary redistribution of income so that borrowers gain and lenders lose. Now, inflation, as we mentioned earlier in our earlier part in the lecture series, that governments aim for low and stable inflation, and low and stable inflation is actually the 2 to 3% inflation rate. Now, here you can see in the 9th October 2008 newspaper extract that Zimbabwe inflation hits 231 million%. Now, this was during the time of Robert Mugabe, when things actually went out of control, and a loaf of bread, which cost 500 Zimbabwean dollars at the beginning of August, it was around 7,000 Zimbabwean dollars and 10,000 Zimbabwean dollars. Although the central inflation hit so high during this time that the Central Bank of Zimbabwe was actually printing a greater denomination currency note almost every day, and there were 100. There was a currency note in Zimbabwe that had a value of 100 trillion Zimbabwean dollars on printed on the currency note. Now, hyperinflation is so serious that it is when the inflation rate rises by at least 50% per month. And when this happens, the value of money becomes actually worthless. And money fails to money fails as a medium of exchange. So two main functions of money, store of value and medium of exchange, they fail during the time of hyperinflation. And some countries have experienced hyperinflation in the past, and this is also known as galloping inflation, and this is a time when inflation rises at such phenomenal rates that money becomes almost worthless. Now, during this time, obviously, the Zimbabweans may have resorted to barter system, or maybe dealing in international currencies such as the euro, the pound, or the US dollar, because their currency was had hit rock bottom. At the moment, the highest hyperinflation rate in the world is in Venezuela. You guys can do a bit of research on that. So, in this part, we studied about inflation. What's inflation? Its definition. About the various degrees of inflation, stable versus accelerating, anticipated versus unanticipated inflation. And in the last part, we studied what's hyperinflation, which is actually when prices rise by at least 50% or more in a month. Although inflation is measured annually, hyperinflation is so serious that it is calculated on a monthly basis. And during this time, money fails to act as a medium of exchange and it fails to act as a store of value. Now, how to measure inflation? Now, inflation is a macroeconomic objective that most governments strive to achieve. And the stable inflation rate is actually between the rates of 2 to 3%. And why is inflation 2 to 3% so good? Because the three agents of economics, consumers, producers, and the government, they're all happy. And why they're all happy, we'll study this in the later part of this lecture. So, how to measure inflation? There are many millions of different goods and services exchanged in an economy, so most countries track the prices of a selection of goods and services to construct a price index. Now, see, the most common way of measuring the rate of inflation is through the CPI, which is known as the Consumer Price Index. Now, in the Consumer Price Index, for its construction, we need a few things. Now, there are 5 keywords the examiner is looking forward to in your answer. The first one is a basket. Now, what's a basket? It's the basket of goods and services that is purchased by an average or typical family. Now, it's just the trolley of goods that we in a supermarket we buy, and that becomes the basket basically of the goods and services. And what we take in this basket are the goods that are purchased by a typical family. Then we monitor the average price of each item in the basket by a sample of different retail outlets. We can even look in various price journals. We can even refer to the Bureau of Statistics that almost every country has to see what was the price of wheat, for example, 2 years ago. We can see what was the price of tea or rice or pulses, for example, 5 years ago. Third step, we monitor how much the typical family spends on each item in the basket. And how much a typical family spends on each item in the basket, through this we assign the weights. And weights are very important because the weightage that you apply on a particular item, the higher the weightage, that means the more frequently that item is bought in your country. And obviously, if the more frequently the item is bought and its price rises, the people will suffer most. So, first thing is the basket of goods and services that is purchased by a typical family. So the first keyword is basket that you guys will use. The second keyword is the typical or average family that is buying that basket of goods and services. The third keyword that you guys will use is weights. And what is a weight? Weights are assigned, and the higher the weightage, the more the relative importance of that particular item in the basket. That means the more an increase in the price of that product, the more it will matter to households. Then you add all the weighted average prices and make sure that in the base year, that is actually the year of comparison, you set the total weighted average price of the basket equal to 100. And in year 1, you're going to repeat the same process again. Basket, typical of average family that's purchasing those goods and services in the basket. Number 3, weights. And number 4, the weighted average price. But the weighted average price of the basket, that's going to change in year 2. Now, let's see this example, that how you are calculating a consumer price index. In order to do that, we have a simple calculation of the CPI. So in this, we have 4 types of goods and services: clothing and footwear, household goods and services, food and travel. And we have the proportion of weekly household expenditure spent on each category in percentage terms. In the third column, we have average price of goods and services purchased in each category, and through that, we're going to calculate the weighted average price. So, clothing and footwear, if we see that, we see 25% out of a total of 100% is spent on clothing and footwear in this particular economy during year 1. The average price is $44. We multiply $44 by 25%, we get 11, and we repeat the same process with household goods and services, with food, and with travel. So out of the 100%, we are actually spending 25% on clothing and footwear, 10% on household goods and services, 50% on food, and 15% on travel. By multiplying column 2 and 3, we are getting the weighted average price. And by adding the weighted average price of all the 4 items, we're getting a price of basket at $27. Now we are assuming that the price of basket was $25 in the base year. So how did the annual inflation rate come at 8%? So for that, we have a formula, which is CPI in year 1 equals to weighted average price in year 1 upon weighted average price in base year into 100. So we calculated the weighted average price in year 1 as $27, and we were assuming the price of the basket was $25 in the base year. So $27 divided by 25 into 100, we get 108. Now how we get the rate of inflation? Inflation rate is actually whatever amount we get after 100. So 108 minus 100 gives us 8%. So guys, just a quick recap that how we measure inflation is through the CPI, which is known as the Consumer Price Index. For this, you need to know 5 key terms, which are basket of goods and services, typical or average family, which buys those goods and services, weights, which indicate the relative importance of the particular item, the weighted average price that you calculate by proportion of weekly household expenditure multiplied by the average price of goods and services purchased in each category. That gives you the weighted average price. And last is the base year, which is actually the year of comparison. And in the base year, the price index will always be, assumed to be 100. So whatever amount you get after calculating through the formula, which in this case was 108, you subtract it from the price index of the base year, which is always assumed to be 100, and you will get the annual rate of inflation, which in this case is 8%. Now we move on to the uses of price indices. Why we need to calculate inflation? See, the first thing is we calculate inflation because we have an economic objective, macroeconomic objective, low and stable inflation. So governments in all parts of the world, they need to ensure that whatever the rate of inflation they have is desirable, is mild, is stable. So by calculating it through the CPI, we know that if our inflation rate is at 2 to 3%, it's amazing for our economy. But if the inflation rate is creeping, that is, it is slowly and steadily increasing, or it's double-digit inflation, it's accelerating inflation, or it's unanticipated inflation, governments will have to take certain steps, such as imposing contractionary monetary or contractionary fiscal policies in order to make sure that they bring back the rate of inflation to a stable and a desirable rate that is to 2 to 3%. Inflation is used as a price deflator. Rising prices reduce the purchasing power of wages, profits, pensions, savings, tax revenues, and a host of other economic variables of importance to different groups of people and decision makers. A price index is therefore used to calculate changes in the real values over time. Obviously, there are two concepts, real and nominal. Real is something that you take into account after taking into account the impact of inflation. So whether it's real GDP, whether it's real wages, you need to take into account the impact of inflation in order to make sure whether you're making economic growth, for example, in the economy, because economic growth is measured when there's an increase in the real GDP. You can't take nominal values in order to say that you've achieved economic growth. And for indexation involves increasing certain payments and values, such as state pensions. See, these welfare payments are paid to people who are not adding anything to the economy, and they are the people, for example, if there's inflation, they will be the hardest hit. So, in order to make sure that these people who have no other means of income apart from getting transfer payments from the governments, you have to make sure that whatever the rate of inflation is, you need to compensate that change into their transfer payments. For example, if the inflation rate is 3%, make sure that you at least increase their old age benefits or unemployment benefits by 3%, so that at least they break even. And uses of price indices also help employees to negotiate better uh, wages, better salaries with the employers, because inflation erodes the purchasing power of money. So obviously, if there's high inflation, you're worse off if you don't get an increment. So these are the uses of price indices. Now, what causes inflation? There are three causes of inflation that we'll study in our O levels. Now, what causes inflation? Economists today tend to agree that the main cause of inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. This is according to the monetarist school of thought. Now, simple words, we studied about aggregate demand. Aggregate demand has components C plus I plus G plus X minus M in our first part of the lecture series. So always remember, inflation is a monetary phenomenon. If there's an increase in the supply of money in the economy, that is, if aggregate demand is rising faster than aggregate supply, that will cause prices to rise. That is, if the money supply increases at a faster rate than the aggregate supply of goods and services, then the general level of prices will rise. So, too much money chasing too few goods, that is, aggregate demand rising faster than aggregate supply. So, the money supply may expand to meet demand and cost pressures. So, the first one is demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation is caused by aggregate demand rising faster than aggregate supply of goods and services, and this causes the economy to overheat. There's too much money in the economy, and there are too few goods. Too much money chasing too few goods is actually demand pull inflation. Cost push inflation occurs due to rising wages and other production costs, or maybe firms. The two reasons for cost push inflation: rising wages and the production costs is rising. So firms will raise their prices to cover these additional costs. Third one is imported inflation. Imported inflation occurs when your country's currency depreciates. Now, when our country's currency depreciates and we rely too much on imports, for example, Pakistan has to import at least 400,000 barrels of oil every day, and we know we don't have enough money to buy those imports, and our exchange rate is constantly depreciating because of the current account deficit, and in order to finance that deficit, we have to take loans from foreign international financial institutions such as the IMF. So our currency is always depreciating because we don't export much and we're an importing country. We need everything that we mostly the things we need for raw materials, even for our factories, they're all imported. So imported inflation, that's due to a fall in the exchange rate of the importing country. And why exchange rates fall, we have a chapter on exchange rates, which we will do later on. But simple, you don't export much and you rely on imports. Your foreign exchange, you'll always need foreign exchange to finance those expenditures in the form of imports. Now let's talk about the costs of inflation. See, we discussed earlier that low and stable price inflation is beneficial for an economy. In our first part of the lecture series, we discussed about why governments strive for inflation rates that are at 2 to 3%. Reason: consumers are happy because prices are not rising rapidly. Producers are happy; they're getting the extra profit. Government is happy; they're getting the extra tax revenues. But investors are also happy because the value of money is not declining rapidly, so they know they can invest in that economy, and they can get good returns. And when investors they invest, the economy, that's tremendous for any economy. There'll be economic growth, there'll be industrial growth, there'll be GDP growth. There'll be employment, people will be coming out of poverty, you'll be having strong middle class. So it's amazing. But if inflation rises, we discussed about hyperinflation, and hyperinflation is the most serious form of inflation. And we talked about Zimbabwe, and currently the highest inflation rate in the world is in Venezuela. But there are also creeping inflation, and we also discussed about accelerating inflation and unanticipated inflation that uh, brings instability and uncertainty. So, what are the consequences? What are the disadvantages of inflation? See, when inflation is high, it erodes the value or purchasing power of money. People, especially on low and fixed incomes, they cannot buy as much as they did before with their incomes. Demand for many products will fall if real incomes continue to be squeezed. And see, when demand for products fall, obviously unemployment will rise because firms, they won't be making much money, they won't be making revenues, hence no profit. So when firms will be facing a hard time, they'll have to lay off workers. Inflation increases the costs of production and reduces profit margins. Again, bad news for em- the employees. And again, when costs of production rise, the output will decrease because there's no incentive for firms to produce, and this will have serious consequences on economic growth. Inflation reduces the price competitiveness of exports. If you're producing goods at a high rate and your products are elastic, so obviously you're competing with other countries for a fair share of the market. So obviously exports are going to go down, and people will buy goods from your competitors. Inflation creates economic uncertainty. Consumers, firms, and governments will be uncertain about their future costs and the impact rising inflation could have on their incomes and revenues. Firms may cut their investment, and consumers their spending.